Good day and welcome to the following discussion in our series Why Christianity Needs to Wake Up or Disappear. I traditionally use the word need to die, but that's a bit harsh, so we will use the word disappear. In last week's video, I touched on the fact that Jesus was a Nazarene and that word came not from being a member of the town of Nazareth, but it came from the Essenes. There were three major groups of Essenes. The first group, or the most well-known, was the Essenes themselves, who lived in a town called Qumran, and we have their scriptures discovered in the 1950s, and it is known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you can go and read what they have said and what they have believed. Two other groups, which is not so well known, also existed. One at Mount Carmel, to the north of Jerusalem, close to the Mediterranean coast, and that group was known as the Nazarenes. They were later organized within a small village that was called Nazareth, and that's the first time we read about a village called Nazareth. In later years, long after the time that Jesus was on earth, the town of Nazareth to the north of Jerusalem came into being. That did not exist when Jesus was born, and that's important to know. Josephus, a historian of the time, wrote extensively about Palestine. He traveled the whole area. He visited most of the towns and wrote about them, and never ever did Josephus even refer to a town called Nazareth, because the town did not exist. So Jesus was a Nazarene, not because he came from Nazareth, but because he was part of the group, or larger group, of the Essenes. The third group then we know is the Therapitai, who lived in Egypt, and that is probably why Joseph and Mary fled to Egypt with the infant Jesus to escape Herod after Herod wanted to kill Jesus. And they fled to a group of people that they knew, which was part of the Essenes, and they stayed there for a while. And Jesus was then brought up in the tradition, we believe, of the Essene. The Essenes, there are a couple of well-known people that was part of the Essenes. In the book of Acts, we read of Paul as being accused of being a ringleader, so a major role player in the Essenes, a ringleader of the Essenes. You can go and read it in the book of Acts chapter 23. So if Paul was in the Essene, and he is the first person actually that wrote about Jesus and his teachings, then surely Jesus was definitely an Essene, but rather one of the Nazarenes, which was part of the bigger group. John the Baptist was an Essene. He lived in the wilderness. He was known as the voice in the wilderness. And according to his family tradition and lineage, and this is quite interesting, John the Baptist should have been in later years one of the high priests in the temple in Jerusalem. He was not, because the Romans politicized the temple in Jerusalem. They pushed out the traditional blood lineage of the high priests that came down from the family of Zadok, and the Zadok family can be traced back through the lineage to Aaron, the person that went with Moses and supported Moses to help him to get the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. So there's a long lineage of Zadoks that played this leading role in the religion of the Judean people and later the Israeli people. This is important to understand if we want to understand the teachings of Jesus. So with that out of the way, Jesus was not from Nazareth. He was maybe from the village of Nazareth, which was the Nazarene village of the Essenes at Mount Carmel. We can now look at the teachings of Jesus. There are very important things that Jesus taught. One of the things that he did, he was always teaching in a parable, and I touched on that on the sermon of last Sunday. And this type of teachings, like teachings through a parable, a story, or a metaphor, or a miracle, which is a parable in action, demonstrated. Jesus used the way of the Essene. That is the way the people of the Essene taught. They spoke in parables. Partly, I believe, because they couldn't speak loudly themselves and voice themselves against the temple and the new high priest, which was appointed by the Roman Empire, and therefore they would speak in a subliminal language, in metaphors, in symbols, and in parables. And that became their way to critique the temple without speaking out loud or without naming the thing on the name, but they were very much against the Pharisee, the Sadducee, and the temple in Jerusalem due to the politicization of this institution of the Jewish faith in Israel at that stage. And Jesus was part of that. He has been recorded many times to be very outspoken about the Pharisees and against the Pharisee and Sadducee, and he didn't hold back. He really went for it. He also demonstrated through his actions that he was not pro-temple in Jerusalem. He went there, he cleansed the temple, very well-known piece in the Gospels, threw over the tables where they were exchanging money so that the people that came from outside the city could have the shekel, which was the only money recognized by the temple institution, and then they had the shekel to buy the proper sacrificial animals, and the temple controlled that. You have to buy from them because their animals were better than those that the people brought, and the priests would inspect these animals the people brought and say, no, not good enough, rather buy one from us. This was a greedy system. The temple just became this rich institution, and Jesus was firmly against that by demonstrating that. He's also recorded to say it is easier for a camel to move through the eye of a needle, which is the small entrance that people used next to the gates of Jerusalem. So it was easier for the camel to go through that eye of the needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. And that, he said, because he was so against this greediness, this wealth that the temple collected from the poor people of the country that came to bring their sacrifices to satisfy their God, Yahweh. So Jesus was also not pro-sacrifices. He never brought sacrifices to the temple. We know once when he was a child, they produced him with a dove to bring as a sacrifice, but he didn't partake. As a rabbi, you would expect him to partake on a regular basis in the sacrifices in the temple, which he didn't do. And he got that from the Essenes. The Essenes were very outspoken against animal sacrifices, the flowing of blood and all that rituals that the temple had to pay for the sins of the people of the time. So that links us very firmly to the idea that Jesus definitely was an Essene. The other fact that we can name is that the Essenes was very anti-wine. They did not drink, especially not socially. And everybody, all Christians, would scream, then Jesus couldn't be an Essene because he used wine to institute the Holy Communion during the Last Supper meal that he had before the crucifixion. So now we're going to look at that, and there's a couple of surprises for you in that. So the original term in the Hebrew language, and this is important because the rituals and the worship and all the rules around the temple rituals and the religious rituals was based on the Talmud. And the Talmud was written in Hebrew. So Hebrew language is now important for us. So the word that we in the English language translate as wine was yayin. Yayin is spelled with a Y, yayin. The Greek word in the Greek text of the Old Testament is oinos. Oinos. Yayin, oinos. The Latin word is vinum, and then the English word wine. There is a very close correlation in the stem of the words. So that is more the pronunciation and the sound of the word than in the consonants, which is traditionally used to determine the meaning of the words in Hebrew. So in these words, which spans over 4 different languages, we have the Hebrew, the Greek, the later Latin, and then our language that we use today, English. So from Greek to Latin to English, all 3 those languages are Western languages. So therefore the deep meaning of the consonants fell away because that is not used in Western languages. So that's why we do not look, when we compare the 3 Western languages of the Greek, the Latin, and the English to the original Hebrew, we cannot do that on the basis of the consonants that Hebrew used, but we can do that on the basis of the stem of the word. So you hear wine, vin, oin, yin. So we have that I sound running right through, which is similar right through all the words, even across the different languages. Now, interesting. When we translate the word into English, we translate the stem. We translate the sound, and therefore it became wine. And that is quite different from translating the meaning of the word. So what was the meaning of the word yayin in the Hebrew language that we now translate as wine? Jesus, in his first miracle, parable, remember, in his first miracle, he changed water into wine. And he did it at the end of a wedding. And the host was really flabbergasted. Where does this good wine come from? Now, if we hear this with our Western ear and Western mind, we immediately think of a bottle of good old red wine, something like a Cabernet Sauvignon or something that you really like, and you would think like, wow, Jesus created this Cabernet Sauvignon, this beautiful wine. Even the host said, where does this wine come from? Not true. If we go back to the Talmud, which is important because this has to do with the ceremonies within the religion of the people of the time. The Talmud determined perfectly which yayin, which wine in the English language, should be used during a religious ceremony. Now, the wedding was a religious ceremony at that stage. So people would bring their own yayin, they would bring their own wine. People differ from each other. So some people were rich, some people were poor. Some people brought the freshest wine that you could find. Other people, probably what was left in the house after 5 or 6 or 7 days. Why is this important? Because the Talmud determined that the good wine was the juice of grapes that's not older than 3 days. It meant unfermented juice. Did you hear that? Unfermented juice. So when you hear the word yayin in the Hebrew language, within that word, it meant either fermented or unfermented juice of the vine or the grapes. So it meant either wine or juice. In English, we have 2 different words for these 2 different drinks. We use the word juice or grape juice, and we use the word wine for fermented grape juice. Hebrew is not like that. Hebrew, only one word, yayin. And yayin meant fermented or unfermented juice of grapes. Now, the Talmud determined 3 days old, very fresh juice was not fermented, and that was to be used during religious services. So when this host came to Jesus and he tasted this yayin that Jesus created by changing the water into the English wine, he was surprised. He said, this is perfect. This is so fresh. This is so beautiful. This is perfect for the ceremony. Where was this yayin? Where did you hide it? How come we only have it now because it's better than all the other yayins that the people or the guests of the wedding brought? Now we move on. Jesus and his disciples have the Last Supper together before the crucifixion. He knew what was coming. This is the last time they would share a meal. Communal meals for the Essenes were very important. They were people that were focused on a very basic life. The rule when you joined the Essenes was go and sell everything and share it with the community. Jesus taught that to his disciples. He taught them that with what they have, they go into the world. That's how he sent them out as apostles. So Jesus was really into this life of no riches, life of no greed, life of, I wouldn't say poverty, but a life of simplicity. So when he and the disciples came together the last time at the Last Supper, they did it in the way the Essene did it. The Essenes would have had a communal meal together. Everybody bring the food that they could and sit together, and it becomes this communal event. And that's what Jesus and his disciples did. They brought what they have, and they brought it for a specific reason, to have the last ritual together, the Last Supper together. Wouldn't you think that Jesus would go out of his way to bring the best yayin, the best wine, to this occasion? Of course. Why would he bring old fermented wine? This is the last time he and his disciples would gather around a ritual, a communal meal, which was a ritual for the Essenes. And therefore, that wine that the Gospels speak of and that Paul also referred to would have been yayin, of course. It would have been the proper wine as the Talmud expected it to be. It would have been not older than 3 days, because it would have been the best wine, like the wine that Jesus made in the first miracle when he changed water into wine. So did Jesus drink wine? Yes, he did drink yayin, but it was unfermented wine, not fermented wine, because he was an Essene. And that's another aspect of the teachings of Jesus. We cannot understand Jesus properly if we do not see it against the background of the Essene teachings that he knew and that he taught. Jesus was Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus was Jesus the Essene. He came to John the Baptist, who was a well-known Essene in the community of Qumran. He let John the Baptist baptize him so that he could show publicly, through parable, through metaphor, that I am part of these teachings of John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is being quoted of teaching no wine, poverty, simplicity, that his whole life was built around that. So therefore, Jesus wouldn't have been different. I hope this sheds some light about what happened at the Last Supper, which we so easily refer to as wine and bread. And this coming Sunday at Faith United in Hamilton, and you can follow us on YouTube, I'm going to speak about the second concept, and that is the bread. Have a great week and see you soon.